Namaste, everyone. My goodness, we have quite a crowd, quite an international crowd tonight. That's great. Let's begin with some meditation. So just bring your mind back from all the space around you. Feel the space your body occupies from head to toe. The inner space that is your private meditation cave. And let your mind come back from all other time, back from memory in the past, and back from anticipation. Just feel the present moment as closely as you can through the flow and the touch of the breath in your nostrils. Just watch. Notice how everything shifts the moment you begin to observe. Your breath becomes longer, smoother, and deeper as it naturally self-corrects. And you may even feel as if your whole body is breathing. Current of prana flowing with the breath. The feeling of being alive. Which is so easy to forget to feel these days. Let that gentle current of breath and prana flowing free and deep help you let go of any tightness in your body, muscle by muscle. Feel inside the top of your head and your forehead. Feeling inside any tightness there, till you can allow those muscles to release and relax. Feel down around your eyes and eyebrows. As those muscles let go, feel inside your cheeks, and the corners of your mouth. Let them just hang on the bones of your face. Feel inside corners of your jaw. Relax your neck. Relax your throat. Feel out along your shoulders. releasing any tension in your muscles as you go. Relax your upper arms. Feel inside your forearms. Let them go. Release your hands, your fingers, and fingertips. From your fingertips, feel back inside your fingers. And back inside your hands, as if your fingers could just float away. Feel from your hands back inside your forearms. And let your hands go. Release your forearms. Feel back inside your upper arms. Relax your shoulders. And your throat center. Kneel down inside the center of your chest. Release your upper back and upper chest. Relax your rib cage. Feel inside the center of your chest. Space. The yogis call it Chid Akasha. Also, Hrid Akasha. Consciousness space. Heart space. Breathing free and deep from the space. Relax your heart center. Feel down around your navel. Your hip joints. Your gluteal muscles. Relax your thighs. your knees, your lower legs and calves, your feet, all your toes. Relax your toes. Feel the whole body breathe. Feel that gentle current blowing between your navel and your nostrils. Just listen. Your mantra come. Gently going. Drawing your mind more and more still. Subtler and subtler. Feel that flow along the bridge of your nose, between the eyebrow center and nasagra, where the nose bridge meets the upper lip. Mantra sound resonating in that space. Feel that flow through the left-hand channel in the left nostril. Now feel that flow through the right-hand channel in the right nostril. Now, leave left and right. Go between these two, deeper, towards a chamber of silent presence. through these deeper layers, higher frequency, this great space, whose presence we share. Now gently let the mental vibration ripple on the surface. Feel calm. Let it merge again. In the gentle flow of breath and calm from head to toe. Let the whole mind become full of that sound. The mind turn gently outwards. Feel the stillness and the solidity of your physical body. Let your palms come before your face. Maintaining this inward focus, let your eyes gently open. Feeling the mantra reflected in your palms. And let your mind move gently outwards, observing its motion. Allowing your heart to fill your palms with the fragrance of gratitude. Imagining a beautiful blossom offered for the sake and the welfare of all beings in ignorance and suffering. The prayer of gratitude to the Perennial Guru Spirit, whose presence we share whenever we sit together in this Chidakasha, space of consciousness. Oh, Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Hmm. Apparently my microphone is creating some disturbance. So I think what I'm going to do is take off the earphones altogether and just use the microphone on the computer. Good evening, everyone. We have to wave these days in order to have some interaction back and forth. It's great to see everybody. Our topic this evening is on my desktop here somewhere. There we go. Yoga or Buddhism? Yes, meditation. When Phyllis asked me to prepare something for this evening, she wanted me to talk about yoga and Buddhism. And I think very often in these conversations, as has been the case throughout history, people get very much caught up in the philosophical debates between the Hindus and the Buddhists. And you hear people saying things that that don't make a lot of sense. I mean, even relatively experienced people like Richard Davidson, the great researcher of Buddhist meditation, was once heard to say, yogis don't meditate, only Buddhists really meditate, which is silly. And this has just so often been the case. People get all caught up in arguing the philosophy or the theology. And whenever we get caught up in those discussions, we're immediately mired in categories. And one of the things that we learn from a careful study of the Yoga-sutras is that our whole experience of our world is based on the words and ideas and concepts that populate our mental life and really determine our experience of our reality. And the processes of meditation gradually take us beyond that domain, enable us through the refinement of our breath awareness and the refinement of our concentration to punch through that screen of words, ideas, and concepts to be able to perceive whatever we may call the reality. And so, by way of the process of meditation, after a while, you begin to realize that there really isn't a whole lot of practical difference between the experiences of yoga meditation and Buddhist meditation. The forms may be somewhat different, the terms may be somewhat different, but as Jon Kabat-Zinn, the great writer about mindfulness, is fond of saying, many doors, one room. And what often emerges out of scientific research as an apparent differentiation of different types of meditation, in reality is just enumerating different starting points. Because, of course, you can start your meditation by focusing on anything. And all of those things provide us with different places to begin. It's a really important point because so much time over the centuries has been spent arguing about the philosophy and the theology. But the people who really practice, the people who really sit down and do the work, and what eventually becomes the child's play of meditation with each other, don't bother too much about the terms. You know, if you read, for example, Swami Rama's autobiography, Living with the Himalayan Masters, you hear him talking about learning from great sages of many, many different meditative traditions. Yoga traditions, Hindu traditions, Buddhist traditions, Christian traditions, Jewish traditions, all kinds of different people, Sufis. And to those people, where you come from in terms of your ideas doesn't matter so much. And for those who really know the gems that you find in the depths of meditation, you know that there is a particular beauty in each one of those paths. And if you really do the practice, then it's possible to see the beauty. And one of the things I'm most grateful for, being rather old in human terms now, in terms of my involvement in meditation, is that as I begin to explore a new spiritual tradition, you can just see where the authentic spirituality is in that tradition. And those things are much the same from tradition to tradition. This expresses what in the field of comparative religion is called the perennial philosophy hypothesis of comparative religion, which was originated by way of a book by the same title written in the 1950s by Aldous Huxley. And Huxley was one of those really interesting people who came to the U.S. after World War II, along with Christopher Isherwood, Stephen Spender, and several other great British literary figures, and settled out in California. And they all sort of were in the orbit of Swami Prabhavananda of the Vedanta Society, which is how all of these people, got into those ideas, and how the great novelist and short story writer Christopher Isherwood ended up becoming also a great author in terms of books about Indian spirituality. So when you really practice, you can see these commonalities from tradition to tradition. And you begin to see what is authentic in the traditions in which you were raised, which is the most beautiful thing, I think. And Swami Rama was always sending people back to their origins, back into their original spiritual training. My friend David Alcalay in New York runs the Genesis Society and has a center there in upstate New York. Came to know Swami Rama in the 1970s. He'd been a yoga teacher for 5 or 6 years before he met Baba in 1970. And as he gradually got to know Swami Rama, one day Baba took him aside and he said, "You grew up Jewish, didn't you?" And of course, he was like all the rest of us hippie children back then. He didn't really follow the tradition in which he was raised. So he said, "Yes, that was my family's faith." And so Swamiji said to him, "Good, you become a rabbi." So he packed him off to rabbinical school, and he indeed became an Orthodox rabbi. And these days he is our authority in the mantra tradition that we have, because he's also one of the mantra initiators trained by Swami Rama. The authorities on mantras in the Jewish tradition, which is a really interesting one. It's one of the places where you can see these commonalities so clearly. In the mystical traditions of Judaism and Kabbalah, there is a mantra science that's almost identical to the one you find in Kashmir Shaivism. So the beautiful thing about being a meditator, and that's the reason for the second half of the title for tonight's talk, is that if you really do the work of meditation, then the answer to these kinds of either-or questions about spirituality becomes yes. It becomes a both-and answer. And I think that's a really important thing to remember, because that's really the kind of tradition that we come from. When Swami Veda used to talk about the tradition that he was given by initiation by his master, it was the tradition that included all of the different techniques of meditation in all traditions of the world. And he often referred back to that as Veda. Even though he was a great scholar of the Vedas, the actual books of the Indian tradition, his notion of Veda was something beyond even that. It was a transcultural mass of wisdom that is the source of the revelation of all spiritual texts from any tradition. And it's something that all cultures share and no culture can own. And so one of the interesting things to do, I think, is to find the ways that our own original cultures embody and practice those traditions. Now, as a therapist over the years, I had the great experience of doing some therapy with people from all kinds of different traditions, including a lot of different Buddhist practitioners from many of the different communities in the Twin Cities. That was a wonderful experience. It taught me many things. Among other things, it taught me that those communities have just as many problems as any other spiritual community does. So whenever we run into difficulties at the meditation center, I never feel too alone or particularly strange about them. And one observation I've made over the years about Buddhists in America, given the fact that so many people in America are raised in one form of Christianity or the other, is that for a lot of American Buddhists, Buddhism is Christianity not. I find so many of those communities end up embodying the same kinds of difficulties that carried those people out of their original traditions in the first place. It's a little bit like the theory of karma. You know, the trouble in your sanskaras follows you wherever you go. So that's another reason, I think, for not emphasizing the differences too much. That's really the work of scholars and theologians. Scholars are interested in differences and distinctions. Meditators are interested in how things are the same. They have a mind, we cultivate a mind that is, as the Yoga-sutras would say, samadhana, harmonizing, pulling things together, seeing the connections between things, rather than a mind that is vyuttana, focusing on how things are different and separate and isolated and fractured. So a samadhana mind heals our fractured experience of reality. And I want to look at Buddhism through that lens. This first occurred to me in my undergraduate studies when I was trying very hard to be a scholar, was completely immersed in studying the Yoga-Vasishta, wonderful text, very deeply influenced by Buddhism and many other things as well. And I was writing the essay that went along with my final paper, and I had to spend a lot of time reading both very difficult texts of Advaita non-dual Vedanta and also some texts of the schools of Buddhist philosophy, particularly the Yogacara and Madhyamaka schools of Mahayana Buddhism. And it was giving me a headache. I mean, they were very difficult. It was very difficult reading, lots of terminology, lots of sitting there and having to think my way through what all these different terms and concepts and distinctions mean. And after a while, as I was really getting pretty dispirited about the whole enterprise, all of a sudden, this little voice in the back of my mind said, "Stoma, It's just words. And all of a sudden I went, oh, okay then. These differences are primarily semantic. And they're semantic differences because different people focus on different facets of the holistic experience, and they express that facet as if it's the whole thing. So, for example, in Buddhism, you have people talking, certain schools of Mahayana Buddhism, you have people talking about the ultimate reality as Shunya, as something totally empty and void. Well, yeah, it's void of all concepts and words. And the Hindus talk about ultimate reality as Brahman, the expansive, the all-encompassing nature of that reality. And of course, that's because they're focusing on that expansive aspect of the experience. The truth? It's both at the same time. It's both utter voidness and total fullness. And how do you say that in words? You know? Buddha, when he rose from the seat under the Bodhi tree, didn't want to teach, probably for this very reason. He didn't want to speak about his experience because it would, by definition, limit and fracture that experience. However, one of the things he gained in his enlightenment was the perfection of a compassionate heart. And so, when he saw the suffering in the hearts of his disciples, and they begged him to teach, gradually he agreed to teach. What is the first thing out of his mouth? Dukkha. Or in Sanskrit, dukkha, suffering. As if to say to them, I see your suffering. And that's life. Even what we think of as the good parts of life, we're suffering. Because we're afraid we'll lose them. Or we're afraid we'll lose this very life. And so he began to teach. And he began to elaborate a philosophy. We'll go through some examples in a minute of how the philosophy that he talked about, the practical parts of it, are absolutely parallel to what we do and what we describe in the yoga philosophy. But I want to make this experiential point first. It's so important. Back in 2012, Swami Veda was getting messages from our students in Thailand that the monks, the Buddhist monks in Thailand who belong to the oldest school of Buddhism, the Theravada school, had been telling our students, don't do that meditation, don't do that yoga stuff, don't do the mantras, you'll go to hell. Just like, many of us would have heard from our priest or our pastor or our rabbi, right? And so Swamiji decided, he agreed eventually to come to Bangkok and to give some lectures to try to heal this and to give them some way of understanding the path of meditation that allows them to be religious Buddhists, but also sincere meditators. So he gave this wonderful series of lectures, and the people in Thailand recorded those lectures. Tanya and his team recorded them, and I would so love someday for this to get turned into a book. Because what he did in those lectures over the course of 3 or 4 days is to illustrate how every word the Buddha spoke for the first year after he rose from the Bodhi tree is also in the Veda. Every word that Buddha spoke, you can also find in the texts of the Veda. Does that mean that Buddha is somehow some kind of crypto-Hindu, some kind of secret Hindu, or that his teaching is derivative? No, it doesn't mean that at all. Because what he did, his heroic journey, was to take the meditative traditions that he inherited in his time, and he learned from yoga masters. He took that into his own meditation, took his meditation all the way back to the absolute source, to the highest practice. And then, after having attained that enlightenment, came back out of that state of meditation with a revelation that was appropriate to his time and his place and his culture. And so he elaborated a philosophy appropriate to the people of that time. And its emphases, the way that it seized on the facets of the meditative experience, were somewhat different than the way the Hindus looked at it. So everybody starts fighting about what's right, you know. It's kind of like when Swami Rama would teach a technique to a bunch of disciples. He'd teach it 5 different ways to 5 different bunches of disciples, and then you sit back and watch everybody fight about who's right. When the truth is, everybody's right, all of these variations are legitimate, and they all serve a particular purpose. And so, I'd like everyone to understand the relationship between yoga and Buddhism in that way. Part of the reason for the similarity of all these traditions is that every system of meditation, without exception, no matter what culture it comes from, begins from the observation of the breath. Every single one. And this is seizing on a fact of human neurophysiology that is really the key to the whole shebang. If you look at chapter 34 in the first chapter of the Yoga-sutras, the Samadhi Pada, this is the sutra that I always look at. Those of you who've had the Yoga-sutras class know that this is the sutra I go to whenever I see a new translation of the Yoga-sutras to see if the people know what they're doing. Because the Samadhi Pada of the Yoga-sutras was written for people who are ready to go right into Samadhi. It was written for the most advanced disciples. And the sutra says in Sanskrit, Prachardana vidharanabhyam va pranasya. And because the word prana is in there, many commentators on the Yoga Sutras, including even the major traditional commentators, assume that Patanjali is talking about some practice of pranayama. In fact, some parts of our own Himalayan tradition teach it that way, even to this day. But what Swami Veda realized when he read that, and he also found this to be in harmony with the interpretations of the other 2 people that he felt, among all of the commentators on the Yoga Sutras, had gone through the entire course of training in meditation. This is Bhojaraja of the 10th century and the contemporary monk Hariharananda Aranya from Bihar. And those commentators are entirely in line with Swami Veda's interpretation of that sutra. It doesn't talk about pranayama. One of the rules of reading sutras is that if Patanjali uses a term for something and he uses a different word somewhere else, there's no such thing as a synonym in sutra literature. If the word is different, the concept is different. And here, the words that he uses for inhalation and exhalation are totally different from the words he uses when he's talking about pranayama. So it has to be something different. And what it is prachardana, is the careful observation of exhalation, vidharana, the careful observation of inhalation. And it even has within it the word dharana, the yogic term for concentration. So the gist of this sutra is that all of our training in meditation is about refining breath awareness. And in truth, many of you have heard the story about Wolfgang's question to Swami Rama one time, having seen Swami Rama materialize a letter that Wolfgang had left in his apartment when he came to ask Swamiji a question. The letter comes floating out of the air into Wolfgang's hands, and he says, "Swamiji, can you teach me to do that?" And Swamiji chuckles at him and says, "Son, just refine your breath awareness. All of this will come to you. And I tell this story over and over and over again because that is all of yoga in a nutshell. Just refine your breath awareness. All of this will come to you. All of the advanced practices of yoga will become spontaneous experiences if you take your breath awareness deep enough. And there are layers and layers and layers and levels and levels and levels to it. So let that become your endless fascination. Even just the process of sitting and feeling the breath in your nostrils and realizing from that feeling, I'm alive. Just breathing gets a sense of wonder when you realize what it is and where it can take you. So all of our systems, the first and most important commonality between yoga and Buddhism is that it is all about breath awareness. It is all about prana, apana, anusmriti, or in Pali language, pana, apana, sati. These are the most fundamental sutras on mindfulness in the most ancient layer of texts in the Theravada tradition. And it's that breath awareness that's practiced exactly the same way in the yoga tradition and the Buddhist tradition. And if anybody in yoga tries to tell you different, then you probably ought to run, because somehow they're off the track. They're getting caught up in some concept or something that is a partial truth. Another commonality between yoga and Buddhism that we find in the Yoga-sutras is the importance of the Madhya Pantha, the middle path. The famous story in Buddhism is that Buddha had done these very severe practices, fasting almost to the death. He's almost dead, lying next to a river. And a boat comes floating down the river with an old teacher giving a music lesson to a student in the boat. And he says, as the boat is passing Buddha, if the string is not tight enough, it will make no sound. If it's too tight, it will break. It's about getting the string just right, getting the instrument just right. That's really what our practices are about being able to get our body and our mind in a state that is just right to be able, as Swami Veda said, to enjoy with concentration, which is his definition of austerity, of tapas. And this is something you don't hear from many other teachers. And I think it's one of Swami Veda's greatest contributions to the world of sadhana, is to understand tapasya as enjoyment with concentration. You want to fast? Then really taste your food. And if you really taste it and you really enjoy it, and you really focus on the beauty in it, probably you'll eat a little less of it. Your natural appetite will gradually reduce. And that goes for all of our desire-driven, instinctive drives in our life. And Patanjali says in, I'm trying to remember which sutra it is. It's not coming to mind. But it's in the Samadhipada, in Vyasa's commentary somewhere. He's talking about the fact that practices of tapasya, of austerity, ought not to be so severe that they create imbalances in the dhatus, and the constituents of the body, and imbalances in prana, because those things lead to illness, which becomes an obstacle to your sadhana. So it's important to stay healthy in the process of doing sadhana, and it's important to keep a good, balanced, healthy state of mind. Um, and so, for example, if you have a desire that you're trying to deal with, banishing yourself from the object of that desire is a very crude way to try to gradually get rid of the desire. And it doesn't really work, because if you bring the object back, all of a sudden, blammo, there you go. So in Swami Rama's last body, as Swami Ramatirtha in the 19th century, he had a real attachment to apples. He loved apples. And one day a disciple had brought him a beautiful plate full of apples. And he could feel himself wanting to eat all those apples. So he takes an apple, and he takes it in his hand, and he so lovingly and carefully cuts that apple into slices, lays the slices out on a plate in front of him, and he sits there for a couple of days contemplating the apple, taking in his whole relationship with this apple without yet tasting it. And then only when he felt that his overweening desire for the apples had exhausted itself did he take a piece of apple and eat it. And at that point, his overattachment was gone. So, mere non-indulgence often isn't quite enough. You have to really learn how to deal with what's going on in the desire of your own mind. This is something that the great alcohol recovery program, AA, is really good at doing with people, helping them to understand what their real problem is that is expressing itself as an urge to use alcohol at any given moment. If you understand what you really need, then if you meet your real need, well, the appetite for the addictive substance goes down, goes away. And it may not go away permanently for some time. That's why they really focus on living life a day at a time, which is a great thing to do in general terms. I mean, to really stay focused on as much on the present as possible is the way to live your life. Live each day of your life as if it were your last. And you'll probably have a pretty full life. So this middle path of tapas is something that is common between the practical traditions of yoga and Buddhism. Another really important commonality is that the way that the definitions of suffering and of ignorance, which is intimately related, are the same. Not only are they the same, they actually use pretty much the same terms. In the analysis of suffering in Buddhism, you have what Buddha called the fourfold noble truth of suffering. It begins with dukkha, suffering. There is suffering, and all of life is suffering. Dukkha hetu, the cause of suffering. Of course, the cause of suffering is ignorance. And we'll come back to that in a bit. Then you have the elimination of suffering. Dukkha, dukkha hetu, suffering and the cause of suffering. Then you have hana upaya. Hana means elimination. Upaya means means. So the upayas are the means of eliminating suffering. And then you have dukkhana, the elimination of suffering itself, as the goal of the spiritual practice of Buddhism. Dukkha, dukkha hetu, hana upaya, dukkhana. In the Yoga-sutras, you have the identical analysis, except that in the Yoga-sutras, what Patanjali calls suffering is heya, that which is to be eliminated. It's a future participle of the same verb root that is the root of the word hana, elimination. Patanjali was probably the second greatest grammarian who ever lived in any language. And so how he structures his words carries part of the meaning of the Yoga-sutras. So in order to really get the juice out of the Yoga-sutras, at some point it's a good idea to study some Sanskrit grammar, because then you really can begin to get some of that extra degree of richness that comes from how he chooses and how he structures the words that he uses. So in Yoga-sutras, starting with Sutra 16 in Chapter 2, which we'll be getting to in the upcoming series of Yoga-sutras lectures that begins 2 weeks from tonight, or a week from Monday, actually. It's called heya, the rejectable. Suffering is that which we want to get rid of. Then you have heya hetu, the cause of suffering. And of course, the cause of suffering is avidya, ignorance. Then you have, just as in the Buddhist system, hana upaya, the means of eliminating the rejectable, and heya hana, the elimination of ignorance, which is the solution to our problem of suffering. Absolutely the same in both traditions. And actually, the same thing holds for the philosophy of Ayurveda, the philosophy of traditional Indian medicine. Instead of dukkha or heya, it begins with roga, illness. Roga hetu, the cause of illness, which is ultimately avidya. Hana upaya, the means of eliminating illness, and roga hana, the elimination of illness. And in the Ayurvedic tradition, the elimination of illness is really much more about prevention than about remediation. There certainly are remediation measures in Ayurveda, but the real strength of Ayurveda is in how it thinks of the human being holistically. Which reminds me, I just got in the mail today a copy of a wonderful book on yoga therapy. For those of you that are interested in yoga therapy, it's, I neglected to bring it up here with me. Ordinarily, I would just run and go get it, but oh well. It's by my friend Lee Majewski and Ananda Bhavanani. Lee is I'm not sure what her profession was before she got into teaching yoga, but she's a visiting faculty member of Kaivalya Dhamma, one of the most traditional modern yoga teaching institutions, just a couple hours east of Mumbai in India, even though she lives in Toronto at the moment. Ananda Bhavanani is a physician and the head of a doctoral level yoga therapy training program at the medical school in Pondicherry, but also is the successor of a very authentic and traditional yoga lineage that goes back to this yogi named Ram Gopal Majumdar from Paramahansa Yogananda's Autobiography of a Yogi. And they wrote this lovely book about yoga therapy. Lee had cancer a few years ago, and over time developed a wonderful set of workshops to help people recover psychologically from the ravages not only of the cancer, but also of the cancer treatment. And she found that the medical system tended to sort of kick people out at the end of their treatment, just at the point when they were at their lowest, psychologically, emotionally, and just utterly exhausted. And so they often found themselves without any support at that moment. So she developed a wonderful set of workshops to deal with that. And Ananda contributed to the book primarily by, Joanne is sending me the title, primarily by writing a beautiful essay on yoga therapy, which tries to go after the notion that yoga therapy is just sort of an alternative therapy that we tack on to traditional medicine. If you're going to really practice yoga therapy, it is a different way of looking at a whole patient, a different way of diagnosis, a different way of seeing the person in context, in the whole context of their life as a way of dealing with the illness. And so if you're really interested in yoga therapy, it's a beautiful essay. and I highly recommend it. I wrote a review for the publisher, and they liked the review well enough they actually made it the foreword to the book, so I actually contributed a little bit to the book. But it's a wonderful piece of work, and I love these two people. They are just wonderful people, both of them, and they've really contributed something important here. So the way that yoga looks at suffering, the way that Buddhism looks at suffering, the way that the Ayurvedic system looks at suffering, all the same. In practical terms, there's no difference. As we said in looking at suffering, the cause of suffering is what the Patanjali referred to as heya, the rejectable, and that is avidya. And the definition of avidya is also identical in the two traditions. I'm just dialing up the sutra here. This is also in chapter 2, Nasadana Pada, sutra number 5. And I'll just read this in Sanskrit for those of you that have done a little Sanskrit study. I won't try to dwell on it. Anitya shuchi dukhanatmasu nitya shuchi sukhatma kyatir avidya. Avidya is the erroneous cognition, of anitya for nitya, non-eternal for eternal, ashuchi for shuchi, impure for pure, anatmasu, non-self for atman, self, and suffering, dukkha, for ananda, which here is represented by the word sukha. In many places in Sanskrit, sukha means ordinary pleasure. Here it refers to the joy of ananda. And in yoga and meditation, those two things are very distinct. So that's the definition of ignorance. And it is exactly, the terminology is even identical in both yoga and Buddhism. And so these core ideas are really the same in terms of how both traditions look at what we are about in our practice of meditation. The final major similarity that I want to talk about are these qualities that are mentioned in Sutra 33 of Chapter 1, the Samadhipada, that are referred to in both yoga and Buddhism by the term Brahma Vihara. The word vihara refers to both a garden, and the connotation is a beautiful garden, a joy garden. And it also means a walk in such a garden. And so this term Brahma Vihara means a journey in the joy garden of spirituality, spiritual practice. Same idea in both traditions. What is this joy garden? Tapas. Enjoyment through concentration. Enjoying your life. Enfolding your life in an experience of joy that comes with the growth of your experience of mindfulness in the practice of tapas. The early Buddhist monks called their monasteries viharas. And that term stuck in the contemporary name of the state of Bihar. Bihar is called Bihar because it's the site of all the first viharas of the monks of Buddha, because he wandered in that part of India at first. These Brahma Viharas are described in both Patanjali and in the great Buddhist meditation manual called Visuddhimagga, or in Sanskrit, Vishuddhimarga, the path of purification. Chapter 9 is about these practices. Maitri, from the word mitra for friend, friendliness. Swami Veda always used to translate this term as amity. I think it's a slightly old-fashioned usage of the word, but I really like making it the concept of friendliness because it links up with Buddha's idea of teachers, for example, not as paragons of virtue or as these great distant figures sitting up on a throne telling you what to do, but rather as spiritual friends, as people who teach you through their friendship with you. And this was the most beautiful thing about Swami Veda. And Swami Rama as well. They didn't sit there and teach people ex cathedra. Swami Veda would take me aside and we would have a talk about some serious aspect of my spiritual practice. And when I was feeling a little perfectionistic about how far I'd gotten with it, or about my ability to persevere, he would look at me and he would say, Stoma, if I can do it, you can do it. And that's what a friend says. And that friendly aspect of your relationship with all creatures, whether you're teaching or not, is so important and so lacking in the world that we have. I have to remember, and I think most of us, particularly in the United States, have to make a discipline of remembering every once in a while to mentally practice how you could be friends with Donald Trump. It's really important to do that. You can't just think of this guy as evil incarnate, because the minute you do that, you start creating suffering sanskaras for yourself. You have to understand this man's suffering. And I can only bear to entertain the thought for a few seconds, because I do understand as a psychologist how terrible his suffering is. This is a man who has never known 1 second of happiness in his whole life. Not one. His whole life is pain and avoidance of pain. Many of you may have seen the PBS documentary, The Choice, which they do at every presidential election, where they go back and take a really deep look at each candidate. And the phrase that keeps coming up in the life of Donald Trump is to learn to be a killer in every context. And you look at the people who are his mentors, his teachers, his father. Just like Donald Trump is another person who you can't find a picture of Fred Trump smiling or looking even vaguely pleasant. And his other great mentor in life was Roy Cohn, that horrendous lawyer who was the chief counsel for Joe McCarthy's Senate committee on, or House Committee on Un-American Activities. So it's important to make a little bit of a discipline out of understanding what suffering is there, because then you begin to get an idea of how to deal with the suffering of people like that. And your sense of how to help to alleviate the suffering of the people around you becomes clearer. Even if all you can do is just listen. And a lot of times that's all you can give people, is just an ear. But that is so important and so powerful. One of the things I'm most grateful for is the way that my training as a psychotherapist taught me the power of just listening and of keeping my own sense of helplessness about the situation in the background. while I listen. So, maitri, friendliness, very important quality. Karuna, compassion. Really what we've been talking about. The ability to feel others' feelings as if they were your own. The suffering feelings as well as the joyful feelings. So that when somebody is doing well and having a joyful life, you can enjoy their enjoyment. Swami Veda used to say this all the time. I'm somebody who throughout life has, off and on been concerned with losing weight. And I would always try to be very disciplined about my food intake when I was at Swami Veda's table. And he would always say, Stoma, when you're at my table, you eat, because I need to enjoy your enjoyment. But it's learning to join people in the felt experience of their life. And also to be able to extend that same sense of compassion towards yourself. Much harder for most of us to do. And when you really start to do that, and you really start to understand the nature of your own suffering, then you have something of great value to offer others. You know something about how to ease people's pain, even if all you can do is to say, you're not alone, and I really do understand what you're experiencing. Not perfectly, but good enough, I hope. So, compassion, the second Brahma-vihara. Next one, mudita, joyful mind. The more you deepen your practice of mindfulness, the more you can make a mental habit of staying aware of your breath all the time, throughout your whole life, the more joy you'll get, because there's a certain kind of joyfulness that goes with that. It's something that's actually even measurable in brain research. So there's this subtle joyfulness that comes from just being aware. And gradually that gathers momentum in your mind. And what's wonderful about that is that this happiness, this is what the Dalai Lama really means when he talks about happiness. This happiness, this joyful way of living your life, is absolutely steady and solid. It becomes unshakable. Now, I knew Swami Veda for a very long time. I knew him for 45 years. So I knew him when he was much younger, in his 30s, and he had quite a bit of fire in him at that point, a lot more energy. He could get mad at people in the 70s. This happened. This happened with me. And by the time he came to the end of his life, nothing could make him angry. And he made a practice, which Swami Rama used to beat him for, of never allowing himself to express an angry thought to anybody. Even if he was really disturbed at what the person was doing, he would never allow that anger to cross his lips. Whatever he said would be compassionate and loving and friendly. And as a result of that, people could hear what he had to say. They were willing to listen because they knew there was nothing they had to defend themselves against. His teaching for them was full of ahimsa. And so they could open up and take it in. Even me. So by the end of his life, nobody could make him angry. And I tell you, I had a therapy client who, when her mental illness was really rolling, she was hell on wheels. And she would send him the most awful emails, horrendous name calling. And she would copy me on all these emails, so I'd be sitting there at my computer, fuming away, and watching Swami Veda respond, never losing his understanding of where this was coming from in her suffering. All he had to offer her was understanding and love, and it kept her alive. it was the single most important nutrient in her life. So that was a very potent lesson for me in cultivating that kind of joyful mindedness that doesn't get shaken. In these times, living in a zoo cage, living with this political situation that is just crazy as all get out at every level, is a pretty big test of that sense of joyful mindedness, I have to admit. So far, so good. I can sit and kvetch with the best of them, and I do that with my friends who know me and understand me. But there also is this other part that really doesn't get shaken. And all I can say about it is so far, so good. And related to that, the last of the Brahma Viharas, Upeksha, or in Pali, Upekka, which means non-reactivity. Literally, it means overlooking. But I think that leads to a misunderstanding of the attitude. And the conventional English translation of this term is usually indifference. That's sort of the dictionary translation. And that also, I think, is a pretty poor word. Because a person with upeksha isn't indifferent. They feel the pain that's going on around them. They feel the suffering around them. But they don't just react on the basis of their emotions. Their emotions arise. They have enough mindfulness to look at those emotions and to ask themselves the question, is it skillful for me to act this way in this situation? And if it's not, then there's a space to think of a different response to make. A more loving response, a more compassionate response. I think the thing that tested me most in this respect in the last months was the night of the riots, because as many of you know, I live right in the middle of the hood. I live right where it was all going on. 3 doors down, people were trooping up and down Lake Street with cans of gasoline and racing cars and setting things on fire. And every 10 minutes we'd look up or down Lake Street and see some new block that was engulfed in flames, and it was pretty intense. So that has been a real test. So I hope, I pray for endurance in my upeksha as much as possible. And I think we all, living in this very difficult time, those of us that live in the United States, really do face a decisive moment in our history. And it's terribly important for us to keep our wits about us, which means keeping your mindfulness going as much as you can. It's so important now. And it's the opening through which whatever degree of compassion and friendliness that you can offer to that suffering world all around us will come. It's what makes you skillful, what makes you some kind of a healer in those kind of situations. These are talked about in both the yoga tradition and the Buddhist tradition as practices. And they are. But they're also signs of progress in your meditation. They are qualities that appear naturally in the mind and heart of somebody who's growing. So often, Swamiji, people would ask Swamiji, is my meditation doing any good? And he would say, how are your relationships? Are you more friendly? Are you more compassionate? Are you joyful-minded? Are your emotions steadier? Your mind clearer? So those are also things, reliable signs that you're getting somewhere in your meditation. And of course, the best way you hear about these are from other people, not from looking in the mirror. Because, of course, if we're looking in the mirror, guess who in that little noisy box of mind is involved? Your ego. But it's when somebody takes you aside and says, I don't know what it is about you, but I just feel better when I'm with you. I think at those moments you can say, okay, meditation is going all right. So I hope this gives you some sense of how these different philosophies have systems of practice that really, in the important parts, function in an identical way. And they take us to the same experience, to an experience that has many facets, and trying to describe those facets or make arguments about it or articulate about it in any way requires diminishing the experience. And none of us want to do that. That's why for Swami Veda, the practice of silence was such an important thing. To just be able to go into the silence, which is both Shunya and Brahman. Shunya and Brahman. That is both emptiness and total fullness. That has the whole experience in it, of which our words are a very poor reduction. So don't get trapped in the words. If you're going to get trapped in anything, get trapped in your breath awareness. The key to enlightenment is under your nose, right under your nose. Joke in Hinduism is that God was looking for a place to hide. And he went and hid in the trees. Oh, somebody saw him in the trees. And he hid in the waters, found him in the waters. Hid in the mountains. People went up in the mountains and found him. So he went to one great sage. And he asked, where can I hide that people won't find me? And the sage said, why don't you hide in the center of their minds? They'll never look there. Look there. That's what it's all about. All of it. Whether you call it Hindu or yoga or Buddhism or Christianity or Kabbalah or Sufism or whatever. It's all about looking in that country. If any of you have questions, feel free to unmute yourselves and ask them. We are pretty much at the time, but I'm certainly free to sit here for a bit if you have some questions. I should probably open up the chat as well.
I'd like to see Nina Palaska's face one more time.
So you want to see Nina Palaska's face one more time, huh?
Hi, Nina.
There she is.
Hi.
We did a satsanga with some of the students in Australia a little while ago. It was lovely. And for those of you who may be interested, on Monday evening, I think it starts at 7:30, I'll be doing a lecture on yoga, on meditation, yoga and neuroscience for the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. This will also be a Zoom thing. And if anybody's interested, through email me, I can send a link. And maybe what I'll do is send a link to Phyllis at the center.
When is that?
I think that's probably okay. Monday evening, 28th. And I'm gonna review some of the major themes of looking at meditation through the lens of neuroscience.
Will it be recorded, I hope?
Yeah, it will be. It'll be recorded. In fact, they're planning on recording it, and I'll probably record it as well.
Well, I put into chat, I thought that Upeksha and Avalokiteshvara, I mean, it sounds quite the same.
It does. And
overlooking,
this is
but
really
being able to see all sides of an issue so you can act appropriately.
Yeah. Avalokiteshvara is the bodhisattva of compassion. In the Mahayana tradition, you have these 4 families of different forms of Buddha. And different bodhisattvas are associated with each of these 4 families. If you want to read a lovely book on it, there's one by a British Buddhist monk named Vasantara called Meeting the Buddhas. Very well done, very carefully researched book. It's just excellent. And so Avalokiteshvara is the bodhisattva of compassion. He is Avalokita. Now we're all familiar with Swami Veda's favorite practice, Atma Tattva Avalokanam, right? This Avalokana, it's the same word. Loka is cognate, as a verb, is cognate with the English word look. Ava means down. So the compassionate bodhisattva is looking down at the suffering of the world. And one of his brother bodhisattvas, Maitreya, the Buddha to come, is always depicted like this. He's always depicted looking down at the world he is to enter. To consider, as it were, how can I help? What can I give? So it's the same idea. It's a beautiful metaphor built into the words.
Would those 4 families of the Buddhas, the Bodhisattvas, correspond to the 4 Viharas?
Vaguely. I mean, I'm sure you could work it out. I'm trying to remember what the 4 primary forms are. It's always hard for me to remember all of them. One of them is Amitabha, which is the compassion and love family. This is the one that is actually probably the most popular in East Asia. Then there is Samantabhadra, who is solid, steady. I'm blocking the other 2. But it's
Manjushri would be like discernment, right?
Yeah, Manjushri is a bodhisattva that belongs to one of the families, but he's not the primary Buddha of that family. I'm blanking.
But Meeting the Buddhas, right?
Is that Meeting the Buddhas is the title of the book. Yeah, beautiful little book.
Stoma, isn't Avalokiteshvara looking east, west, north, south, up, down, and also isn't he, she, part male, part female, or both?
Sure. Right. I mean, all of those qualities are part of Avalokiteshvara.
And the Dalai Lama is supposed to be the incarnation of...
Right. Avalokiteshvara is in many parts of the Tibetan tradition is depicted as male. In other parts of East Asia, Avalokiteshvara becomes Kuan Yin. Okay. Enough scholarship for tonight, huh? Thanks, everybody. It is just wonderful to see your faces. You know, I just like everybody else, I suffer from a little bit of this, sense of dullness and heaviness that comes with these times. And every time I get online with you folks, it just perks me right up. So I'm so happy to have these opportunities to see you all.
Hi, Diane. Hi, Michael. Hi, Paul. Hi, Amelia.
And so does Joanne. Take care, everybody.
Hey, Joanne. Thank you, Stoma.
Take care.
We'll see you all. And for those of you in the Yoga-sutras class, we'll see you in almost a week. Almost 2 weeks.
Thank you.
Beautiful talk, Stoma.
Thank you.